We need to ensure that our policies are fair and equitable for everyone.
I agree, and we must also consider the practical implications of these changes.
In a courtroom built on silence and power, one voice shattered tradition, and even Chief Justice John Roberts couldn't hide his reaction. The room, carved from marble and history, was designed to make mortals feel small. Yet that day, the weight of legacy bent toward something unexpected, a truth spoken with such force that the air itself seemed to tighten. What happens when truth is so undeniable, even the highest seat of law bows its head? That question hung unspoken, vibrating in the walls in the stillness of every robe, every pen stilled mid-scratch, every gaze flicking toward the bench. Roberts, the man who had spent decades cloaked in control, betrayed the faintest crack in his composure, a reaction not rehearsed, not performed, but real. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, the embodiment of institutional permanence, a judge whose gavel had echoed across years of precedent. On the other hand, Jasmine Crockett, underestimated by opponents, is often caricatured as brash, too sharp, too unrelenting. They expected noise but not resonance. They expected defiance but not brilliance. In that collision of expectation and reality, respect was born. Her words didn't just fill the chamber, they shifted its gravity. The very air seemed to tilt, and eyes once directed toward the high bench now settled on her. For a moment, the robes, the rituals, the centuries of ceremony dissolved into background noise. What stood undeniable was the voice of a woman who refused to bend, and Roberts knew it. His face, usually a fortress, gave away more than he wished. The flicker of surprise, the reluctant nod, the thin line of lips pressed not in judgment, but in acknowledgement. It wasn't the sound of a gavel that moved the room that day, it was the sound of respect landing where no one thought it would. This was no ordinary clash of arguments. It was a fracture in tradition, a ripple against marble, a reminder that even the most unshakable towers of power can be swayed by truth. But to understand why that moment mattered, we have to step into the shadows of this courtroom battle and see how one voice turned silence into history. John Roberts built his reputation on composure. For decades, he was the steady hand at the center of storms, a man who wore neutrality like armor. His gift was never letting the world glimpse the man beneath the robe. To many, he was the face of judicial permanence, untouchable, unreadable, an institution wrapped in human form. Across from him stood Jasmine Crockett, known not for silence but for fire. She was the one who burned through pretense, who wielded her words like a blade sharpened by years of underestimation. Where Roberts mastered restraint, Crockett mastered exposure, pulling truths out from the shadows and setting them aflame until no one could look away. In contrast, a collision was inevitable. But this was more than a clash of personalities. The courtroom itself carried centuries of weight, not just marble and columns, but the accumulated voices of power that had spoken here, mostly men, cloaked in hierarchy. It was not just the law being argued. It was the soul of democracy itself staged for an audience larger than the room's citizens, hungry for proof that truth could still pierce through ceremony. The cultural stakes stretched beyond the walls. For Crockett, it wasn't about scoring a point. It was about identity, survival, dignity. She stood for those who had been silenced, those who had been told their voices were too loud, too sharp, too inconvenient. Her fire carried the echoes of communities accustomed to being spectators in a system designed to judge them without ever hearing them. Against her, the establishment wasn't embodied in a single man but in everything Roberts represented. His robe was more than fabric, it was a symbol of order, hierarchy, and an insistence that power must always flow from the bench downward. Tradition was the shield, precedent the sword. To challenge that was to challenge centuries of structure that had defined who belonged and who did not. The tension was not just intellectual, it was emotional, visceral. The robes represented distance, a world above the people. Crockett represented the raw, unfiltered pulse of authenticity. When her voice cut through the chamber, it was not just words clashing with law, it was authenticity demanding to be seen against the carefully constructed silence of power. The audience, whether seated in the gallery or watching from afar, understood the stakes. They weren't waiting to see a legal technicality unfold. They were waiting to see whether dignity could stand against hierarchy. Every syllable spoken became a testee. Could one voice alter the rhythm of an institution built to resist change? Roberts' calm exterior made the moment even sharper. His reputation was not built on arrogance, but on control. If he faltered, even for an instant, the world would know it wasn't weakness. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement in that chamber was everything. So the scene became more than just a legal exchange. It was a stage where identity collided with order, where history pressed against the present, and where one woman carried the impossible weight of expectation on her shoulders. The court was no longer simply a chamber of law, it became a battleground for democracy's soul. The stage was set, but who would truly command it? The courtroom was never designed for voices like Jasmine Crockett's. Its architecture, its rituals, its very language carried the weight of silence, a silence that worked best for those already at the top. The system itself was the antagonist: polished wood, marble pillars, robes that concealed more than they revealed. It was built not to welcome disruption, but to absorb it, to smother it beneath layers of precedent and procedure. And at the center of it sat John Roberts, not evil, not malicious, but a man fused with the machinery of tradition. His legacy was control. His art was in equilibrium. To him, every case, every hearing was a delicate balance, a stage he commanded not through fire, but through silence that swallowed fire whole. He was the arbiter, the guardian, the face of an institution that survived precisely because it refused to bend. The irony was cruel and sharp. Roberts, the judge who rarely betrayed emotion, now stood on the edge of being upstaged, not by a rival justice, not by a towering legal mind in his own circle, but by a woman many underestimated, a voice that wasn't supposed to echo so loudly in this chamber. His greatest strength, composure, now threatened to become his greatest weakness. For the first time, the mask of calm authority was not protection but liability. Every raised brow, every shift in his jaw, every pause too long carried meaning. The system designed to silence was about to find itself tested, not by defiance alone, but by the truth that demanded to be heard. And deep within that marble chamber, the mask of composure trembled. Jasmine Crockett was not the figure tradition had prepared for. Too sharp, they said. Too relentless. Too unwilling to soften her edges in rooms where edges were expected to be filed down. To her critics, she was combustible, an energy to be contained, not celebrated. Yet it was that very fire, so often dismissed as liability, that forged her into something rare, a presence that could not be ignored. Her journey into that chamber was paved with sacrifice. Every risk taken came at a cost, her career dissected under unforgiving lights, her words twisted, her motives questioned. She had carried the weight of stereotypes that pressed on her shoulders like chains. Every time she spoke, she knew she wasn't speaking only for herself. She bore the burden of proving that voice, passion, and unflinching truth could not be reduced to caricature. It was the wounds that prepared her, the dismissals, the ridicule, the times her questions were brushed aside. All of it had shaped the steel beneath the fire. She was the unlikely hero, not because she lacked strength, but because so many had convinced themselves she couldn't wield it. When she entered the courtroom, she did not come searching for applause. Applause was fleeting. Respect was earned. What she carried was heavier than ambition. It was truth itself, honed into a weapon sharper than any gavel. She didn't walk in to perform. She walked in to pierce through the silence. She walked in to make power listen. She walked in carrying truth like a sword. And she was ready to draw it. The air in the courtroom tightened as the exchange began. It was subtle at first. The little interruptions, the clipped tones, the questions asked not to hear, but to undermine. Each time Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, someone seemed eager to step on her words, to dilute their power before they had the chance to land. It wasn't chaos, it was control disguised as order. The condescension came layered, polite on its surface, corrosive underneath, a raised eyebrow, a smirk that vanished as quickly as it appeared, a reminder about decorum. That seemed to apply only when she spoke. The message was clear: stay in your place. This wasn't a conversation, it was a cage, and every rule was designed to keep her voice smaller than it truly was. But Crockett refused to shrink. She sat steady, though inside her chest, patience was being ground down like stone under water. Each interruption was a test, each dismissal a provocation. Every second she waited was a weight pressing on her lungs, daring her to collapse. Yet the more they pressed, the more she sharpened. Like David before Goliath, she was expected to falter under the shadow. Instead, she studied the cracks in the giant's armor. The tactics grew bolder. Overtalking became a weapon. A question was posed, then twisted before she could answer. A statement cut short, replaced by a lecture she had not asked for. Gaslighting settled like smoke. Suggestions that she was overreacting, that perhaps she misunderstood, that the problem wasn't in the room but in her perception of it. They tried to turn her certainty into doubt, her passion into recklessness. But if the courtroom was a stage, the audience wasn't blind. They could see her steadying herself with each blow, hear the frustration building in the clipped rhythm of her pauses. She wasn't shouting, but the restraint in her voice carried its own thunder. It was the silence before the strike, the kind that makes everyone lean forward, knowing the storm is coming. Her eyes burned, not with anger, but with the clarity of someone who had been here before, who had weathered attempts to erase her voice countless times. The more they tried to diminish her, the more the room felt the imbalance, a single voice forced to carry truth against a wall of authority. The image etched itself into the silence between words. Still, the rules of decorum were wielded again and again, not as guides but as shackles. Wait your turn. Address only the bench. Stay within the bounds. Each reminder was a thread pulled tighter around her, an attempt to suffocate momentum. To them, order meant silence. To her, silence meant surrender. Inside, her patience was fraying, her composure stretched to breaking. Every second she held back, the weight grew heavier. But that weight was also fuel. It pressed her down, yes, but it also pressed her sharper, like coal under pressure turning to diamond. And the audience felt it. The murmurs stilled. Breaths caught, as though everyone in the chamber sensed the inevitability. A storm had been brewing since the first interruption, and now the clouds gathered thick and dark above the chamber. The tension no longer belonged only to her, it belonged to everyone watching. They weren't waiting for her to falter. They were waiting for her to break through. Then came the moment. The interruption was too sharp, the dismissal too blatant, the attempt to silence too transparent. The patience she had carried, the composure, the restraint, the endurance of indignities, snapped into something else entirely. The room went silent, the air felt electric, charged with the kind of anticipation that makes hearts pound before sound even returns. The storm that had been building, second by second, was ready to break. And then, it broke. The moment of fracture came like glass cracking under hidden weight. One more interruption, one more dismissal, and then the balance of the courtroom collapsed under its own arrogance. What had been designed as containment became exposure. What had been meant to weaken her only revealed the strength that had been gathering, second by second, behind her restraint. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words cut sharper because they carried the weight of everything that had been denied her. Each syllable dropped with precision, not scattered like sparks but driven like nails into the chamber's silence. You ask me to respect the rules of decorum. She began, her tone level, her gaze steady, but decorum isn't silence. Decorum isn't submission. It's honesty, it's accountability, and if this courtroom has forgotten that, then someone has to remind it. The room stilled. The attempt to overtalk her faltered, and suddenly there was space she claimed not by permission but by sheer command. Her cadence rose and fell like a tide, measured yet unrelenting. You tell me to wait my turn. But I have waited. I have waited while voices were ignored, while truths were buried beneath formalities. And now, when truth stands before you, you ask it to sit down. Her words moved like strikes, each one landing with the inevitability of something long overdue. The chamber, so often filled with the monotone rhythm of procedure, now pulsed with tension. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, then faded into silence as if the audience, too, realized they were watching history bend. Across the bench, Roberts shifted. It was slight, the lean of his posture, the narrowing of his eyes. For a man whose gift was control, the subtlety spoke volumes. Inside, the conflict stirred. He had built his legacy on composure, on a face that could weather storms without revealing the cracks. Yet here was a storm unlike any he had known. Crockett pressed forward. You hide behind rules, but rules were meant to protect justice, not shield power. And when power uses them to silence truth, it is not justice that survives. It is only the silence. The irony was complete. The system, meant to silence her, had only sharpened her. Each attempt to restrain her had added fuel to the words now spilling like fire across the chamber. And Roberts felt it, not as an adversary, but as a witness to inevitability. Her voice grew stronger, not louder but richer, carrying the weight of centuries of dismissal that now found articulation. I will not apologize for speaking when silence is the betrayal. I will not apologize for demanding respect when respect is the very foundation this courtroom claims to protect. And if respect is not given, then it will be taken. Not by force, but by truth that cannot be denied. The silence after her words was not empty. It was thick, alive, a silence that belonged not to Roberts, not to the robes, but to her. The gallery leaned in, as though the air itself carried charge. A cough at the back, a shuffle of feet, then stillness again. The walls, carved for permanence, seemed to tremble with impermanence. Robert's mask wavered. His lips pressed tight, not in disapproval, but in resistance to something deeper, acknowledgement. He was caught between the man and the institution, between his role as guardian of tradition and his humanity as a witness to brilliance. If he betrayed nothing, the moment would still live. But if he betrayed even the faintest flicker of recognition, the moment would be sealed in history. And then it happened. The betrayal of expectation. The judge did not silence her. He did not strike his gavel, he did not lean into the power he held. Instead, his composure betrayed him in the smallest, most seismic way, the faintest nod, a concession not to her alone, but to the truth she carried. It was not loud, but it was heard. The gallery caught it. The murmurs rose again, this time not of doubt, but of awe. The shift was undeniable. The courtroom, once anchored by the bench, now tilted toward her. The gravity had changed. Authority no longer flowed from the robe downward. It flowed outward from her voice. And in that reversal, the betrayal deepened. The system had betrayed its own ideals by trying to silence her, and in doing so, revealed its fragility. Roberts betrayed his own mask of composure, allowing humanity to bleed through the marble. The courtroom betrayed tradition, tilting toward respect for the voice it had not planned to honor. Her final words landed like a seal. Truth doesn't wait for permission. Truth doesn't bow to silence. And today, truth has spoken. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then came the sound, not applause, not outrage, but the raw hush of recognition. The kind of silence that carries more weight than sound itself. Robert's hand, resting on the bench, tightened slightly. His face betrayed what his gavel could not erase: respect. Not demanded, not pleaded for, but commanded. The murmurs turned to whispers, the whispers into stillness, the stillness into a kind of collective realization. Something had shifted that could not be undone. The marble chamber, designed to outlast lifetimes, had witnessed its own hierarchy crumble and reform in a single exchange. Respect was no longer demanded, it was commanded. It happened in a flicker, so subtle it might have been missed, if not for the weight of the moment pressing down on every soul in the room. Chief Justice John Roberts, the emblem of composure, the man whose face was a wall against storms, let the mask slip. A single brow arched, his head dipped in the faintest nod, and there, for the briefest heartbeat, a curve of near smile touched his lips. For a courtroom built on rigidity, it was more than an expression. It was a crack in the marble, a break in the eternal stone. A reaction so rare it carried the force of thunder. The gallery felt it first. A ripple ran through the rows. A sharp intake of breath, the sound of bodies leaning forward. The hush of awe that falls when the impossible becomes visible. Whispers spread like sparks jumping across dry grass. Did you see? He nodded. He couldn't hide it. What had been said as a contest of dominance was now transformed into something else entirely. The polarity flip, the system, cloaked in robes, armed with centuries of unshakable tradition, bowed, however slightly, to the voice it had once sought to contain. And that voice, embodied in Jasmine Crockett, no longer stood as a challenger. She stood as the center, the axis around which respect revolved. For Roberts, the nod was not a surrender, but recognition. Yet recognition in this space was revolution. It meant that truth had outshone authority, that humility had seeped into a chamber not built for it. Arrogance had given way to grace, and silence had turned into its own form of applause. Crockett did not bask in it. Her gaze held steady, her body still, her presence refusing to cheapen into triumphalism. She had not come to break him, she had come to break the silence. And yet, in breaking it, she had drawn even the guardian of silence into her orbit. The room shifted again, not in noise, but in energy. Spectators exchanged glances heavy with realization. Officials adjusted their postures, no longer looming detached. Respect had settled across the chamber like an unseen verdict. Not a verdict Roberts delivered, but one he, too, was bound by. In that instant, the hierarchy inverted. The courtroom's power had always flowed from the bench, down into those who entered it. But now the current has reversed. It rose from the floor, from the words, from the courage that had stood unflinching against interruption. The voice commanded the respect once hoarded by robes. It was moral whiplash, sudden, disorienting, undeniable. The system that prided itself on control had been humbled by honesty. The silence once wielded as a weapon became the silence of reverence. The applause did not come in hands striking together, but in the stillness of awe. In the breathless recognition that something larger than tradition had just occurred. Crockett had not simply won the exchange, she had rewritten the moral order of the room. No gavel strike could undo it, no procedural note could diminish it. The moment had passed into permanence, and so it stood. Arrogance lay low, humility rose high. The courtroom itself bowed, not in ritual, but in respect, and the hero, unexpected, uninvited, undeniable, had not only seized the moment but claimed the hierarchy itself. The storm had broken. And now came the hush that always follows thunder. Jasmine Crockett did not lean back in her chair with triumph. She did not smile at the murmurs or revel in the shifting tides of respect. Instead, she remained still, her face composed, her hands folded, as if to remind the room, and herself, that the truth she carried had always been heavier than applause. In that silence, Chief Justice Roberts lingered longer than he needed to. His eyes, usually trained to drift without pause, rested on her. It was not a stare of authority, nor the detached gaze of the bench, but something quieter respect, a kind of recognition that seemed to admit, not aloud, never allowed, that tradition had been humbled, and that dignity could come from places the system too often underestimated. The courtroom breathed in unison, as though unwilling to disrupt the fragile equilibrium that had just been born. What had begun a sauna confrontation ended not in chaos but in clarity. Crockett had not demanded victory, she had commanded acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, something shifted deeper than verdicts, the idea that power could no longer pretend not to hear. As the gavel struck, the weight of the moment did not vanish. It carried itself beyond those four walls. By the time Crockett walked back into daylight, her phone was already buzzing. Clips spread like wildfire. The nod, the silence, the poised fire in her words, hashtags ignited for courtroom clapback, part truth cuts deep, fire Roberts respect. Commenters declared it the coldest courtroom clapback of the year. Others called it a masterclass in truth under pressure. But the viral buzz only captured half of it. The deeper story lived in the quiet, in the way Roberts' expression had betrayed admiration, in the way Crockett refused to gloat. She had proven that the bravest act wasn't winning applause or dominating a stage. It was forcing power itself to bend, if only for a breath, toward honesty. And so the courtroom's echo traveled outward, becoming less about the players inside and more about the lesson it left behind. Sometimes the system is not toppled in revolutions, but nudged into humility by a single undeniable voice. Sometimes victory is not loud but silent, not flamboyant but still, not measured by verdicts but by respect won in places where respect is rarely given. Crockett walked away unchanged in posture yet transformed in presence. She had not only spoken truth, she had made truth impossible to ignore. And Roberts, the ever-composed guardian of tradition, had given her the respect of silence broken. The thunder had passed, but the echoes would not fade. John Roberts wasn't just impressed, he was humbled by the truth. That single reaction, a nod so slight yet so seismic, told the story better than any ruling ever could. It was the rare moment when the scales of tradition tipped, not because the law demanded it, but because honesty demanded to be seen. The world didn't miss it. Social media lit up with clips replayed millions of times. Hashtags trended. Commenters crowned it the coldest courtroom clapback of the year. Others called it a turning point, a lesson that even the most untouchable figures can be shaken by clarity. For once, it wasn't about partisanship, procedure, or power games. It was about respect, raw, undeniable, and earned. But that leaves us with the question, if you were sitting in that courtroom, whose side would you have been on? Would you have stood in silence, or with the voice that broke it? Was this the moment accountability finally struck power? The story doesn't end here. Because every courtroom, every chamber, every seat of authority faces this same test: can truth still make power listen? Subscribe, because the next question might change everything. One courtroom, one voice, one reaction that spoke louder than a gavel.